It is my great pleasure to share a little bit about our wonderful speaker this evening. He was born in Cork, Ireland. Seán was awarded a Bachelor of Science degree. He majored in mathematics from the National University of Ireland. He was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1972, and he spent the next 14 years working among the Kalenjin people of East Africa. He is multilingual, speaking 6 languages. In 1983, Seán authored his very first book, which he wrote in Kiswahili. He has authored 4 other books since, which, by the way, we have many of them, and he will be signing them after the service. Dr. ÓLaoire has a PhD in transpersonal psychology. He is a licensed clinical psychologist with a private psychotherapy practice in Los Altos, California. Seán's scientific research on prayer has been published in 3 psychology journals. Father Seán is a co-founder and spiritual director of Companions on the Journey. It's a spiritual community which seeks to recognize the God or divinity within each of us and among us. COJ, as it's called, is an independent, non-hierarchical Eucharistic community dedicated to aligning itself with God and healing separations between us. We like that. A long-time meditator of 46 years, his breadth and knowledge of Celtic spirituality is nothing short of spellbinding. And he is a champion for interfaith work. Please help me welcome Father Seán ÓLaoire.
Thank you so much, Seán. Around the time that Lao Tzu was teaching in China and Confucius, around the same time that Gautama Siddhartha the Buddha and Mahavira were teaching in India, around the same time that the great prophet Zarathustra was teaching in Persia, and around the same time that the great prophet of Israel, Jeremiah, was teaching, around that period of time, a band of warriors invaded the most westerly part of Europe, a little island off the west coast of Europe called Ireland. And we knew them originally as the Milesians. They're better known as the Celts. And in 2 great battles, they defeated the local population, a tribe of people who were known as the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Dana, demigods. 2 great battles in the same location, a place called Moytura. And at the end of the second battle, there was an agreement made between them that they would divide the land of Ireland in equal parts between them. But it wasn't that one group got the north and the other got the south, or one got the east and the other got the west. The agreement was that the Celts would own Ireland above the ground, and the Tuatha De Danann would own Ireland underneath the ground. And so the Tuatha De Danann, they shape-shifted, and they became known as what in Irish we call the Slua She, or in English, the fairy host. They transmogrified and became the little people, or the wee people, or the good people. There are many terms for them in Ireland. And that's the beginning of the journey I want to take us on tonight. I want to trace what happened to these Celts and their spirituality. And in order to understand what I'm talking about, I need to define a few terms that I tend to use very differently from their common usage and to differentiate for you. And so, firstly, I want to explain that for me, imagination is not the faculty that allows us to make up stuff that's not real. That's fantasy, that's not imagination. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, enter into different dimensions, interact with energies and entities in those other dimensions, learn from them, and then bring that learning back and cross-fertilize it with this state that we grandiosely call waking consciousness. So it'll be very important as I explain to you what Celtic spirituality is about. This is what imagination is about. It's the most important faculty a poet has. It's the most important faculty a mystic has, and it's even the most important faculty a truly great scientist has, the ability to shift dimensions. The second thing I want to explain or differentiate is there's a big difference for me between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is information which is gleaned by our sensorium and processed by our brain. Wisdom is information which is gleaned through our soul and processed by our heart. And while one of them, knowledge, allows us to maneuver and navigate in the physical cosmos, it is wisdom that truly allows us to navigate in the metaphysical. And the metaphysical is the origin of. The physical world is simply a hard copy of the original blueprint, which is the metaphysical. So if we only have knowledge, we only have factoids, which is my third differentiation. For me, there's a huge difference between truth and fact. Something can be factual, but not true. And something can be true, but not factual. Because my definition of truth is this: something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. So sometimes I give you a fact, but it's not transformative. If I tell you it's 6:02:34 right now, that's factual, but it's not a transformative experience for you. So that which transforms you is the real truth. And that becomes very, very important as we're trying to understand the cosmology of the Celts. So I'm starting with those three differentiations and definitions. So what I want to do then, I want to make 3 points tonight. I want to talk about pre-Christian Celtic spirituality. Secondly, I want to talk about Celtic Christianity when they met. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the Celtic Diaspora. So firstly, pre-Christian Celtic spirituality. So the first thing we understand when you dig back here is that there were 3 orders of wisdom keepers. For me, as I told you, wisdom is gleaned by the soul and processed by the heart. So the 3 great orders of the wisdom keepers, firstly, were the bards. And the bards were either, a bard would be attached to an individual chieftain or a king, or he could be a wandering minstrel who plied his trade. And there were performing artists. There were the great poets that Roger just spoke to us about. There were the great musicians. There were the great storytellers. And we have to recognize, as Roger was reading this beautiful poem tonight, the Song of Abergine, the very first Irish poem, it called to mind for me the I am statements that we find in the Gospel of John. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. But unfortunately, as Christian theology has unpacked those statements of Jesus, it's as if Christ is separating himself by making those statements. It's like Christ is the I am, and the rest of us are just the also-rans. And of course, Christ is not saying that at all. When you unpack it mystically, Christ is pointing out the essence of every single one of us. There is only the I am. Every single one of us is an articulation of the I am. And he's hearkening back to a great phrase in the Hebrew scriptures, in the book of Exodus, I think it's around chapter 3, where Moses has an encounter at the burning bush. And he wants to know who this God is who's sending him back into the land of Egypt, where he's wanted for murder. Now, Moses was not a monotheist by any stretch of the imagination. And so he wants to know, when I go back and they ask me, what God are you talking about? What will I say? And God says in Hebrew, Ehiyeh Ashir Ehiyeh, which is typically translated as, I am who I am. And you get the impression that this God as well is separating himself, that he's so holy that thus far shalt thou come and no further. In fact, you're meant to kick off your sandals when you come in front of this God and go barefoot in front of him. The Song of Abergine that Roger read tonight has a totally different flavor. This is the flavor of the Celt. The I am in this poem is not a stiff-handed, stay away from me, I'm holy, I'm a separate, ontologically discrete entity from you, I am God. It's almost like an invitation to dance with the numinosity of the images. Every single image is an invitation to dance with the numinous, mysterious ineffability of God. So it's got a totally different flavor to it. And that was the function of the bard. The bards were not just entertainers, although they did that, and they weren't just information specialists. They were the keepers of the wisdom of the past. So they were experts in genealogy and they were experts in history. But primarily, they are performing artists through their poetry and their music and their storytelling. And if you ever encounter a great storyteller, or if you're a very good story listener, a story is never about information, and it is not about entertainment. It is about transformation. If you really know how to tell a story, or you really know how to listen to a story, a whole bunch of trans begin to happen. You go trans-temporal, you're out of time. You go trans-spatial, you're no longer confined to this little spacesuit of yourself. You go trans-rational, and I don't mean you go irrational, I mean you go beyond mere reason and logic. And you go trans-personal. You're no longer confined to the sense of separate identity. So the truly great storyteller is the person who brings on that possibility for us. And my grandfather was such a one. I called him Daddy Jim. He was a bard. He was a brilliant musician. He played the fiddle that we saw tonight, the mouth organ, the squeeze box. He played the tin whistle. He played the clarinet. He played the concert flute. He was a great Irish step dancer. And he filled my young soul with the mythology of the Celts. So that was the function of the bards. That was the first order of the wisdom keepers. The second order of wisdom keepers were called the Ovates, and they were the protectors of the future. So their job was to step people through the initiation rites, the rites of passage. So in other cultures, they would have been called the shaman, or the seer, or the visionary, or the psychic, or the prophet. But if you understand prophecy, the prophet is not the person who predicts the future. The prophet is the person who prevents the future. The function of prophecy is not to predict or to prognosticate what is to come. It is to prevent that from happening which appears to be imminent. Because the prophet truly is the only person who sees clearly what is. The rest of us sees what appear to be, or what we're told is there, or what we expect to find. The prophet, the poet, the minstrel, the storyteller, they see what is. And because they can see clearly what is, it's easy for them to see where we're headed. So their job is to prevent the future from happening. So the great prophets of Israel, their job was to call the Israelite people back into the covenant with their God, Yahweh. And the great job of the Celtic Ovates was to call the Celts back into alignment with nature. That was the job, not predicting or prognosticating about the future, but calling us into alignment with our covenant with nature. And the third great order of the wisdom keepers would be the Druids. And the Druids, the word in Gaelic actually means the keepers of the wisdom of the trees. Trees are very, very important in the Druids. And they're the intellectual giants of the Celtic world. They're the great scientists. They're the astronomers. They're the philosophers. They're the psychologists. They're the teachers. They're the priests. They're the healers. They're the theologians. They're the legislators. And they're the judges. They play a huge role in Celtic life. So they're the three orders of the wisdom keepers for the Celts. The Celtic cosmology then existed in three different levels. A little bit like the shamanistic model. There's the realm of the heavens, which is peopled by the gods and the goddesses. There's the realm of the earth, which is peopled by the mortals and by flora and fauna. And then there's the other world, which is peopled by the ancestors and by the fairy folk, the Tuatha Dé Danann. And all of these are absolutely real. All of these realms intersect constantly with each other. And so when you see the great Celtic knots, the tripartite knot, it's these three realms intermingling. They're constantly in conversation with each other. There's a great teaching in Roman Catholicism that's called the communion of saints. Now, I love the idea, but I find it far too confining, and the language is atrocious. Because according to this model, they're only dealing with baptized Catholics who are going to go to heaven. Nobody else exists. And there are three groups of them. The group here on earth is called the church, the church militant. We're not quite arrived yet. And the ones who have made it to heaven safely are the church triumphant. And then the guys in purgatory are the church suffering. So the language is atrocious and is far too bounded. But the notion that we can intercede and interact with each other is beautiful. And so I like to extend this, and I call it the communion of all sentient beings. that everything is an articulation of source, and they're all interconnected with each other. And so I find it extraordinarily beautiful that the third great revolution, the third great scientific revolution of the 20th century, the first was relativity theory, the second one was quantum mechanics, and the third was Bell's theorem, the theory of entanglement. And it was an Irish physicist called John Bell who in the 1960s discovered that literally that every single particle in the universe is interconnected to every other particle in the universe. It was judicious that it would be a Celt who would make the connection among all sentient beings. So there are the three great levels. In Ireland then we have a phrase, we call it a ÓLaoire, literally a thin place. A place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous. A place where the veil between the secular and the sacred is transparent. And when you reach these places, you go through, you walk through, and you feel through these. And you find these embedded in nature in various places. For the Celts, water was such a place for the Celts. And so a body of water, particularly sacred wells, tiny little wells, they could be no more than 2 or 3 feet deep, but they were bubbling water from the wellspring from the breasts of Mother Earth. That was a portal or a sacred place or a thin place. Groves of trees had the same sense of energy for the Celts. Standing stones, rocks had the same sense for the Celts. And so again, fire had the same sense for them. But the soul itself was a portal. Imagination was a portal. Storytelling was a portal. Music was a portal. And so the thin places were not just geographical locations, although there were some of those. Literally, there were individuals who were what I could only describe as mobile tabernacles of the transcendent. So when you encounter these kind of people, I presume the Jesus Christ of the world, or maybe the Mahatma Gandhis of the world, or the Mother Teresas of the world, they are mobile tabernacles of numinosity. And when you encounter them, you're in a thin place. They open up a portal for you. So the notion of the thin places is huge in Celtic understanding. Allied to that is the notion of liminality. So in Latin, the word limina means a threshold, an antechamber from one place to the other. And for the Celts, that was very, very true of the year's cycle. And so there's 4 great feasts in the calendar of the Celts. The 1st of February we call Imbolc, and the 1st of May, which is today, we call Bealtaine, and the 1st of August we call Lunosa, and the 1st of November we call Samhain. But the 2 great pieces are Samhain and Bealtaine. But it's interesting for the Celts, the year began in November. It began in the darkness. And you had 6 months of darkness and then 6 months of light. But they have a very different understanding of light and dark. In the West, we tend to think that darkness swallows up light. Darkness is the enemy and light is what we need. The Celtic worldview is totally different. For the Celts, the darkness is the feminine face of God. It is the womb of all possibility. It is the fecund womb that gives birth to everything possible. And the Buddha would say the very, very same thing. He would say, form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. It is from the womb of the nothingness of the darkness that the light springs. The darkness gives birth to the light. It's not that the darkness swallows up the light at the other end, but it gives birth to the light. And so the Celts had no problem whatsoever with the notion of resurrection. The notion that Christ is born from the darkness of the tomb. That made perfect sense to the Celts. And we have the very same notion. So today's feast, Bealtaine. In Gaelic, Tina means a fire. Bealtaine would mean a very, very great fire. And on the 1st of May every year, the High King of Ireland would light a special fire on the hill of Tara, signifying that the light had been birthed, that the goddess had given birth to light. And we had the very same notion with the day, with dawn and dusk. For the Celts, the day began at dusk. What we would call 6 p.m., that is the beginning. It begins in darkness and it gives birth to dawn 12 hours later. So this notion of the animosity between light and dark is totally inimical to the Celts. It is the darkness is the goddess and the light is the god, and they're lovers, so one birthing the other. The next notion I want to hit on is the single most important facet in the Celtic cosmology is definitely, as Roger mentioned, the respect for nature. So nature is the ultimate portal. It is the ultimate thin place. And what the Celts regarded as the goddesses were simply, they were archetypes of nature. That's exactly what they were. In fact, all the early names for Ireland are goddess names. Banba and Éire and Fowla, all the early names for Ireland are all goddess names. Because the goddesses are the archetypes of nature. And the gods are the archetypes of culture. And so culture and nature are lovers. They're the anam charda, the anam chara, one loving the other. And there was actually a ceremony when the next king of Ireland was to be elected. The contenders would have to go up to a famous standing stone. It was called the Leafoil, the stone of destiny. So 9 or 10 people, each guy wanting to be the king of Ireland. And as they approached the stone, when they would touch the stone, the designated person, the stone would sing. And that was how the king was chosen. But then the king had to go through a marriage ceremony, literally with the land. They had to exchange vows with each other. So the gods and the goddesses were marrying. So it's like the great, beautiful phrase that you find in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Song of Songs, where it says, "Ani la dodi, va dodi li." I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me. So that was the contract. That was the marriage that happened between culture and nature. So very, very different from what's happened in the West, where nature is merely at best a resource and at worst the enemy. So that's the kind of the first point I want to make. Can I grab a bunch of water there, guys? Thanks a lot, Liv. So that'll be my first point. I want to look then at what happened when Christianity intersected with this. And one of the things, having been raised bilingually, and having had the privilege of learning several other languages in Africa subsequently, and steeping myself in the folklore and the mythology of these peoples, what I discovered is that stories are the archived wisdom of a culture. If you want to understand any culture, go to its stories. Stories are not just entertaining little tidbits from their past. It is the archived wisdom of the culture. And if you really want the kind of the distillation of that wisdom, go to their proverbs. Very, very pithily, the proverbs will articulate the distillation of the wisdom of the stories, which is the archived wisdom of the group. So I remember as a young boy, during the summer vacation between, in high school, going to a part of Ireland where Gaelic is still the mother tongue. And I was collecting proverbs. In Gaelic, we call them Seán. And Seán literally means ancient words. And I'm visiting all the old people in this village, and I'm trying to get the proverbs from them. And one old man says to me, he says, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the proverbs. And he was absolutely right. The wisdom of the proverbs is the distillation of the wisdom of the Celtic people. So when two great cultures first meet, and if they're not meeting in an act of aggression or conquest, what tends to happen is there is a cross-fertilization of cosmologies. The stories of both groups get intermingled. And this is what happened. This is how Christianity and the Celtic world first intersected, with the great stories that each of them brought to bear on it. And so it was interesting that the bards chose never to record their stories. They were never written down. Although there was a form of Irish writing, an ancient form of writing called Ogham, spelled O-G-H-A-M, and typically written on the corner of a standing stone. But they chose to never record the stories because they felt that stories should be organic. It should grow and flow with the evolution of the environment in which people are experiencing life. So they never wrote them down. They wouldn't be written down, in fact, until the medieval times when medieval scribes, monks, began to record them. So the trajectory of storytelling in Ireland goes from the bards way back to the medieval scribes, then to the great, what we call the Seán. The Seán is the village storyteller. And such a one was my grandfather, Daddy Jim. And then in the 1800s, some folklorists began to kind of gather these stories together in great compendia. And I was lucky enough to befriend a man who was a major figure there, a man called Seamus ÓLaoire, who in 1922 founded the Irish Folklore Commission. And in the course of 20 years, they collected 1.5 million manuscripts of pages of Irish folklore. It's the most comprehensive folklore anywhere on the planet. And so that's how the two groups intersected initially, the shared cosmologies and the shared stories. And there was quite a lot of overlap. So then I want to look at how did Christianity then physically get introduced to Ireland? And there are lots of different theories about this. The typical one is that St. Patrick came to Ireland in the year 432 as an ordained Roman Catholic bishop, and he converted the pagan Irish. There are three other Celtic myths about how it actually got there. The first one is that Jesus as a little boy, if you read through Luke's gospel, Jesus disappears from the scene at the age of 12. There's no record of him between age 12 and age 30, 18 years missing. So there's lots of different stories what happened to him during those years. And one Celtic myth is that his uncle, who was Joseph Arimathea, was an international trader. And he would come to Cornwall in England to get tin from the mines in Cornwall. Cornwall at that stage was a Celtic-speaking country. In fact, the last Celtic speaker in Cornwall just died in the 1800s. And that he would take the boy Jesus to Cornwall on these trips, and so that Jesus interacted with the Druids, the Celtic Druids of the time. That's the second version of the story. A third version of the story is that Mary of Magdala was pregnant with Jesus' child and fled across the Mediterranean, landed in France, and gave birth to a daughter who became the progenitor of the Merovingian lineage that ruled France until the time of Charlemagne and the Carolingians in the 8th century. That's the third story. But the one I actually believe in, it wasn't St. Patrick, it wasn't these, it was desert fathers and desert mothers from Egypt. The great monasticism of Egypt began with the birth of St. Anthony, who was born in 251 AD. And these hermits would go off into the desert in Egypt looking for more and more remote locations. It was called peregrinatio pro Dei amore, journeying for the love of God, trying to find God by being separated, by being in the wilderness. Now, at some stage, it got a little bit crowded in the desert. So they're looking for more and more locations further and further away. So a whole group of them sail across the Mediterranean, out through the Straits of Gibraltar and up the west coast of Europe and land in Ireland. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The Irish church is very definitely not founded on a diocesan model or a parish model. It's founded around hermitages. So what tended to happen was that a hermit would go into a location. Ireland was very wooded at the time. And the local people somehow would find out. And when somebody died, they'd want their dead one to be buried next to the holy woman or the holy man. So in Gaelic, the same word, it's pronounced kill, but it's spelled in Gaelic, it's spelled C-I-L-L. It can mean either a church or a graveyard. So many of the great place names that you've heard of, like Killarney or Kilkenny or Kiltegan, the word kill itself can mean either a graveyard or a church, because that's how the church started in Ireland. And for the longest period of time, that's how it survived in Ireland. It was a model based on the hermitage, not on the diocesan system. Rome got upset by this at some stage, and they called a council of Whitby, the Synod of Whitby, in 664 in Scotland to try to lick the Celts of England, Scotland, and Ireland into shape. And the Scots finally kowtowed, and the British finally kowtowed. The Celts in Ireland did not. So Celtic Christianity survived another 500 years in its very distinct format, until the Norman invasion beginning in 1169, when Norman conquerors came in via England into Ireland, bringing a whole new kind of Roman Catholicism with them, and new kinds of monks, the Augustinian, trying to impose a Romanized model on the Irish Celts. And they still did not succeed. It would take some hundreds more years before that would happen. In the meantime, in the medieval times, when Europe itself was sliding into the Dark Ages, from that period right up into the 1700s, when in a revolt against Roman Catholicism, which was justified at the time, puritanical Protestantism, disemboweled mysticism, and disemboweled Mariology, and disemboweled monasticism. As well as making some really important reforms, they literally eviscerated the mystical, the monastic, and the Mariology. So let me just treat those for a few minutes each. Mariology is the understanding of the importance of the feminine face of God. And the archetype of that is Jesus, as Jesus' mother, Mary. Now, the Celts took to Mary immediately because she represented the goddess. She represented the archetype of nature. They had no problem whatsoever. So they were very, very dedicated to the veneration of Mary, the mother of Jesus, because she literally represented the archetype of nature itself. And when in medieval Europe and in darkest Europe and in the ravages of a puritanical Protestantism, that Mary was thrown out of the equation, they rallied round her in an extraordinary fashion. And you got some of the great Irish hymns, great hymnals composed to Mary. At this stage, God, the Father, was this distant, demanding deity from the word go. But by the Middle Ages, even Jesus had been turned into this cruel judge. So there's some beautiful music in Ireland. Just sing you one verse of one of them. It goes like this. Yes, man vani muravur, mahir ordri, masloshir, ban the hermanadium, ban la kashtar, faragani. And what it says is this. She is a great woman, Mary, over there in heaven. She is the woman who protects me in battle. She is the woman who protects me from the anger of the king. And the king is Jesus. Jesus had been turned into this monster by the medieval church. He's the judge coming. And so again and again and again, the appeal is to a mother figure, an archetype of compassion. And so there was this tremendous devotion through the rosary and through hymnology. And I remember my great-grandmother, I was 10 years old before she died, she was a Christian mystic. She had this extraordinary relationship with Mary, the mother of Jesus. It was like myself and Roger talking to each other. That's what it was like. And because I was her first great-grandchild, I spent a lot of time with her. And so she would take me to churches on a regular basis. And I remember one Christmas, must have been Christmas 1950, I'm 4 years of age, and she takes me to this big church in Cork City called St. Peter's and Paul's. And it was famous for its life-size creche. Every year at Christmas, they had this extraordinary creche with life-size figures of the baby Jesus in the manger, and the donkey, and Mary, and Joseph, and the shepherds, and whatever, and straw this piled high. And we'd go in there every morning when the church was cleared after Mass, and she talked to Mary aloud. And I'm listening to these conversations, and I was quite used to it. This is what she did. She talked to Mary. And one day, we just found this out obviously later, some prankster saw her going in and knew what the deal was, and he scuttled in ahead of us. She was an old lady and she would take her forever to kind of climb up the steps. He scuttled in ahead and he hid in the straw down where the baby Jesus was. My great-grandmother comes up and she hobbles down and she's kneeling and she's talking to Mary. And about 1 minute into it, this little voice pipes up and says, "Why are you always asking for stuff? You come in here every day and you're always asking me for stuff." And my great-mother says, "Be quiet, child. I'm talking to your mother." So that was how real Mary was to her. And that was the kind of devotion. Because it represented the feminine face of God. That's what it represented. And that got thrown out, unfortunately. The second piece of salvage work was done with monasticism. So monasticism had a very interesting history, started by Anthony of Egypt, who was born in 251 AD. And so these were hermits. Shortly later, there was another great saint called Pelagius, also Egyptian, born in 292 AD, and he believed that these hermits should be able to get together on Saturdays and Sundays for Eucharist and for celebrations. So they lived in the desert separately, but not so far that they couldn't get together for worship. So that was the second development in monasticism. And then in the 480 was born Saint Benedict. And he created the modern notion of the monastery, a congregation of people, men or women, living together, worshipping and working together. So these forms of monasticism reached Ireland as well. But the Irish love a challenge. And so the most extraordinary monastery you'll ever come across is called Skellig Vihil. And it's a monastery that was built on a tiny little island 7 miles off the shore of County Kerry in southwest Ireland. And it looks like a broken tooth sticking up out of the wild Atlantic with two peaks, two broken pieces, one 715 feet high. And there was a little monastery there of 12 monks from the 6th century to the 13th century. But on the top pinnacle, there was a hermit living. Literally, how he even survived the winds, I have no idea. And they lived on seagulls' eggs and fish and rainwater that they trapped. And they lived there from the 6th to the 13th century. And then in the 13th century, European weather got very, 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 very cold, and extraordinary storms. They had to abandon the island. And the island was abandoned until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, my own father, who was an archaeologist, was the first person to spend time. He spent 3 months on Skellig Vihil, and he did all of the drawings and all of the map making of the monastery and the hermitage. And in the 1990s, the University College Berkeley went across there, a professor called Walter Horn, and they surveyed it from the air, from aircraft. And there's this beautiful coffee table book called The Lost Hermitage of Skellig Vihil. And it's my father is a minor author on it. So that was monasticism. The Celts saved that, from medieval Europe. And the last thing they saved was the notion of the mystical. In Celtic cosmology, God is not something to be feared. God is something to be in awe of. So there's this great controversy that raged in Europe in the 400s between an Irish monk called Pelagius and St. Augustine on one hand and St. Jerome. And finally, when they couldn't defeat him intellectually, he was totally fluent in Latin and Greek. St. Jerome said to him, in a kind of an argumentum ad hominem, he's just a fat Irish monk filled up with Irish porridge. This was his response to the controversy. But he was advocating original blessing at the same time that Augustine was advocating original sin. Now, in my own kind of reconstruction, I believe that with the advent of Homo sapiens sapiens, now Homo sapiens sapiens is different from Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens arrived on the scene about 200,000 years ago, thinking people. They could think, but they couldn't think about thinking. That only came 150,000 years later with Homo sapiens sapiens. And these were people who could think about thinking because they could manipulate symbols interiorly, and that gives birth to language. So as soon as we achieve that ability, it seems to me the first use to which we put that language skill was to look at the great existential questions. Who made all of this? So we began to talk about the gods. So the first stage of the spiritual journey is theologians who talk about God. The second stage are the priests. They now think they've established some kind of connection, and covenants. So now the priests talk to the gods. The next group are the prophets who purport to speak on behalf of the gods. And then the fourth group are the mystics who speak as God because they recognize the essence of every one of us actually is that we're God stuff. But there's a fifth group, I believe, and they're the non-dual mystics. So where the theologians are talking about the gods, and the priests are talking to the gods, and the prophets are talking about the gods, and the mystics are talking as gods, the non-dual mystics keep their mouth shut. They don't say anything. Which brings me to my final point. I want to look a little bit at the Celtic diaspora. So it's fascinating to me that I look at the Jewish people who survived all kinds of vicissitude, who have been in exile so often. They were exiled by the great Assyrian Empire in 722 BC. They were exiled by the great Babylonian Empire in 589 BC. They were exiled by the Roman Empire in 70 AD. They were exiled out of Spain in 1492. They were constantly shuffled around. And still, they've managed to retain this sense of a culture and their spirituality. I see the same things with Tibetan Buddhism. Forced out of their own country in 1959, they have proved to be an extraordinary blessing to our world. They brought an understanding of consciousness that the West had long since lost. I think the same thing is true of the indigenous peoples of these continents, the North, Meso, and South America. That the native wisdom of the Native American peoples is beginning to bubble to the surface again, and we're beginning to see their extraordinary understanding of our connection to nature. Now I see the same thing is true of Celtic spirituality. Celtic spirituality survived Roman Catholicism. It survived the Vikings. It survived the Norman conquest. It survived the British. It survived the plantation of Ulster in 1609. It survived the penal laws of the 16th and 17th centuries. It survived the extraordinary famine of 1845, 46, and 47. And it even survived the Great Emigration. The population of Ireland went from 8 million people to 4 million people in a 10-year period because of famine and emigration. But these people brought with them, they brought the core Celtic spirituality. We have a system in Ireland. When I was growing up as a kid in Ireland, the fire was never allowed to go out. We built our fires out of, we call it turf, you guys would call it peat. And at night, when everybody was going to bed, the last person to go to bed was the mother. And so she would take the glowing embers and she would cover them over with the ashes of the fire. And then she was the first one up in the morning, and she would poke it and put some fresh peat on it, and there was a brand new fire again. The fire was never allowed to go out. For there are houses in Ireland where the fire has not gone out for 300 years. And that, I think, that's what Celtic spirituality is doing. It has been covered over by the ashes of persecution and emigration. But now, under the breath of the Holy Spirit, it's been breathed into a new life into it. It's been fanned into flames. So to finish up, what I would say is this, that Celtic spirituality, Native American Indian spirituality, and maybe Tibetan Buddhism, and many of the other great mystical traditions like the Sikh tradition, these are the ones, I believe, that are bringing to our times, they're coming in as an antidote to the soulless, materialistic science that is desecrating nature, and coming in as an antidote to the heartless, small-minded, fundamentalist religions that is substituting awe in the presence of the ineffability of the transcendence with mere dogma and fear of a distant, demanding deity. So what I've learned from my great-grandmother and from my grandfather has led me to the following conclusion. I think life is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that source is having. All of creation is simply God in drag. Thanks, Roger.
Wow.